Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing the reading of John Locke. Now, I don't have John Locke on the screen. I have Thomas Hobbes, but he's an important figure that comes before John Locke. And so, in order to understand Locke, I think you have to understand Thomas Hobbes and how Hobbes and Locke are continuing the tradition that you could say is started by Machiavelli. Now, Hobbes wants to maintain the idea of natural law, but divorce it from the idea of man's perfection. So Machiavelli, in a way, sort of throws a monkey wrench into everything and says, no, we shouldn't think about good or bad in this way. All you have to think about is succeeding, right? And it seems to take away any idea of natural law, that there's a certain right that's based on nature. It's what's right is just simply what's best for you. But Hobbes, in some ways, wants to bring back natural law, but in a new and innovative way. So he's going to bring back natural law, but divorce it from the idea that natural law brings us to make men virtuous or make them good. What natural law does is give individuals rights, and that's what's most important. So natural law must be deduced from the most powerful of all passions, the fear of violent death, right? Natural law is not derived from the first principle, if you might remember from the Aquinas reading on the Treatise on Law, to do good and avoid evil. That's not the first principle of natural law. The first principle is the fear of violent death, right? Self-preservation. That was in what Aquinas talks about the good as part of the good is self-preservation. But for Hobbes, he reduces it. All it is self-preservation. It's not really being virtuous or doing these other good things. Self-preservation is the sole root of justice. It doesn't go any further than that in a way. You can think about it in that way. It's a very reduced natural law. The fundamental moral fact is a right, not a duty. So you don't have a duty to do certain thing for the common good. The idea of the common good is sort of thrown out because, as you might remember from Machiavelli, because statesmen have tried to make men moral, try to guide them as how they ought to live as opposed to how they actually live, they lead to ruin. And so what Hobbes and others after him will try to do, well, look, let's not try to make men a certain way. Let's just go with the facts. And the facts are that people have a right to self-preservation. They don't necessarily have duties to these other things. So the shift goes to rights as opposed to duties. Now, Hobbes talks about natural rights, and of course, you don't know anything about Hobbes because you haven't read him. But I'm just going to give you a quick walkthrough of what Thomas Hobbes argues in his very famous book called Leviathan. Government has the function not of producing or promoting a virtuous life, but of safeguarding the natural rights of each person. So that's the purpose and end of government. Whereas for Aquinas, you might remember, the end of government is to make men good. So the state of nature, Hobbes talks about this concept of the state of nature. He says man is naturally in a state of war against all against all. If you can imagine, kind of like what Montaigne talks about human beings in the natural state, but whereas Montaigne talks about human beings as being relatively in a good and safe, it's complicated, but in general, Montaigne talks about human beings in a much more peaceful way. Whereas Hobbes says from the very beginning, it's sort of the state of war, violence of everybody against everybody. He says that the life of man in this state is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The very famous phrase by Thomas Hobbes. In the state of nature, there is no right and wrong because everybody's trying to kill you. All forms of self-preservation are legitimate. So if you go out and kill people before they try to kill you, it's legitimate in the state of nature because that's the way we are born into this state of nature, and it's a quite wicked state. And peace comes only when individuals relinquish their right of self-preservation and execution and give it to a sovereign power, and he maintains the right. So as you can see in this picture here, the frontispiece of Hobbes, the monarch here is depicted with a sword and a scepter. He has the power of the war for fighting, but then also the scepter for religion. So religion and war. and he has all the power. It's not these individuals or these sects or these different kingdoms. The sovereign must have all the power, and he must take away the rights of these individuals, but then give them back in a way. It's complicated. Don't worry. Don't get too hung up on this. It's just a quick understanding of what Thomas Hobbes is arguing. Now, important for what we were talking about today with Locke, this is the context in which they're writing. So there's the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651, and then we have the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And there are a lot of anti-theological implications of the state of nature. If you think about it, in the Bible, there's kind of a natural state, a state of grace that God has put Adam and Eve in, and then once they sin, they live in a sort of a wicked state where all these bad things happen in the Bible. So it's a very secularized version of this, right? For Hobbes and for Locke, as we can see, there's kind of, for Hobbes, it's sort of the state of nature from the very beginning is bad. But for Locke, there is kind of a peaceful state, kind of like in the Bible, then becomes corrupted. But of course, whereas in the Bible, redemption comes through God, maybe Christianity through Christ. For both Hobbes and Locke, redemption in some ways comes from the right ordering of society by putting people in the right places in the right institutions. You don't necessarily get on your knees and pray, but you take care of the wickedness of the world through certain mechanisms. So in general, Locke tries to show that Hobbes' principle, the right of self-preservation, far from favoring absolute government, requires limited government. So that's something I didn't mention in the last slide, but Hobbes, with the monarch, gives all the power to one monarch. And Locke says the power can be given to one monarch, but it's really not, they have to give their consent. It can't be done without consent. And this is one of the main features that distinguishes Locke from Hobbes. In your reading section, paragraph number 3, it should have a number 3 next to it. This is on page 268. John Locke says, political power then I take to be a right of making laws with penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties, for the regulating and preserving of property, and of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws in defense of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, and this only for the public good. Now, that seems a little complicated, and you're thinking, well, why is he reading this? It doesn't make any sense. Well, all that is to say is that political power is a right, not a fact. Hobbes, in a way, he says it's a right, but he sort of, the monarch has the power and you should sort of give it up to him, and that's just the fact of the matter. But Locke really emphasizes the fact that it's a right based on consent. And that's what really launches a new form of thinking about government. And that's why Locke to this day is so important about giving one's consent to the government. Now, I'll talk some more in detail about what Locke is doing and what you read. So we'll go more into detail about the passages that you read for next class. As I say, Locke launches liberalism. Now, what liberalism is, I'll explain later on. But this is basically the form of government that we have today, that Locke is really the founder of. He's you could say, America's philosopher. Now, John Locke lived from 1632 to 1704. He was a very influential philosopher and actually became quite famous after the publication of the first and second treatise. You're reading the second treatise. Now, the state of nature, this is on page 269, chapter 2, section, paragraph number 4. How does Locke describe the state of nature? How does it differ from Hobbes? He describes men living together according to reason without a superior on earth. So it's not a state of war, and human beings have reason in this state, but it's just simply without human beings. You get without a superior on earth. You could think of maybe the Pilgrims landing on America. So there are these two sovereign nations, you could say, Native Americans, and then also the Pilgrims or Europeans that arrived. And in some ways, they both have reason and they don't have their own laws, but there's no superior above them. And so they can be at peace with one another, but if they were to fight or something to happen, then there's a sort of state of war that breaks out. And Locke describes this as originally as a state of freedom and equality. There is no ruling and ruled. There's simply freedom and equality. Everybody is free and equal. And he gives an argument for the workmanship. God, we are God's property, and therefore we are all equal, and we can't sort of enslave one another. The fact of equality and freedom is central to Locke's doctrine here. And what Locke argues is that there is a law of nature. There is something, an impulse, a standard that's guiding us. And this law of nature guides us to peace. But it also gives individuals the right to punish. So just like Hobbes, he wants individuals to have this right to punish others in the state of nature. But he doesn't go, he says there are certain limits in the state of nature. It's not like Hobbes where everything is unjust, where anything can go, anything goes, no right or wrong. Locke says there is right and wrong. And once somebody goes against you, then you can fight back and preserve yourself. Now, he says that government attempts to restrain the partiality and violence of men. It does this, does this to remedy the inconveniences of the state of nature. So government, like for Hobbes, is important to alleviate the situation of this violence. And the problem is that the state of nature quickly devolves into the state of war. So even though Locke wants to distinguish himself from Hobbes and say there is kind of a peaceful state where human beings have reason and there is a right and wrong, the problem is because there's no superior, it quickly devolves into a state of war. And what he defines as a state of force or a declared design of force upon another where there is no common superior on earth. Again, so it's in the state of nature, but it goes into the state of war when somebody attempts or has a design to fight against you. And the innocent party has a right to destroy the other. Now, to avoid this state of war is one of the great reasons why men put themselves into society and why they consent. So they don't want to, in natural state of nature, you could say men don't necessarily want to leave it. But once the state of war happens, you quickly want to leave and you want government to come in to reestablish natural freedom and equality. Now, one of the main reasons why this text is so important is because it argues against slavery. And Locke wants to make a distinction between natural liberty versus liberty of society. In natural liberty, when we're in the state of nature, we're ruled by the law of nature. Again, you see the distinction here. So it's a return to natural law, but it's different. It's law of nature. It's not natural law. So there's a reinterpretation of natural law going on here. Now, in this state, you're ruled by the legislative power established by consent. Now, this is, liberty in society as opposed to liberty in the state of nature. And it's sort of a negative liberty, if you want to call it that way. It means liberty to follow my own will and not to be subject to the arbitrary will of another man. Locke wants to say it's not license, you can't just do whatever you want in the state, but it is a certain liberty of the individual, negative liberty to choose what I want to do. And this is, if you think about it, modern day politics today, right? I have a right to decide for myself. Government can't tell me what is good or what is happiness or what is the best way of life. They just simply have to protect the rights for me to choose these things. And then he says, man cannot by his own consent enslave himself to anyone, nor the arbitrary rule of another, right? Because we have this right to decide for ourselves, we can't put ourselves into slavery. And anybody that wants to enslave us is trying to put us back into the state of nature, and we can fight against it. During Abraham Lincoln's term here in the United States, there was a great deal of use of the language of natural rights, that this person that enslaved peoples have rights that we cannot be infringed upon, and that it goes against reason, and then it puts men into a state of war. And so you can see how this language of natural rights, law of nature that Locke develops is a strong argument against slavery. Slavery is the state of war. And so that is why Locke says it cannot be allowed. Now, we're moving kind of quickly, but I hope you're following along. This text is extremely dense. So you want to read it carefully and reread it, and feel free to email me if you have any questions, but I'm just kind of giving you the bare bones of it so you can understand what's going on. It might really help you to go back through and read it again and maybe watch the videos again. Now, Locke has a very famous chapter on property. He says self-ownership is based on the right of self-preservation. Because, let's say, a Native American here depicted, I think it's a very beautiful painting, needs to preserve himself, they have the right to kill the buffalo. Likewise, the self-preservation gives us a right to own certain property and to take it away from the common good or the common lot of everyone. And he has something called the labor theory of property, which I'll elaborate later. But it essentially means that if you once you mix your labor, once you use your labor to try to, let's say, pick a bunch of apples, then they belong to you because you've mixed your labor with it. And of course, Locke gives us what is called the spoilage principle in paragraph 31, which means that you can't accumulate so many apples that they'll go to waste, right? Nature you wouldn't go around picking more apples than you need. So there's a natural principle that limits you. This will go away as we see in the text, but we'll get to that in a second. Locke famously says the world belongs to the industrious and the rational. And this gives lots of questions. So, well, a lot of people use this type of reasoning when people came to America and to take away land from Native Americans, because they say, well, they're not using the land belongs to the industrious and the rational. So some people have criticized Locke in these theories and saying, well, it in some ways allows for the appropriation of ancestral lands from Native Americans and things like this. And there's a valid criticism there, I think. Now, with the invention of money, the spoilage principle drops out. Natural limit is abandoned by the invention of money because you can accumulate a bunch of apples and then sell them and then make money and keep that money in storage. So men have a right to larger possessions. And this is because they consent to this inequality. Now you might say, well, wait a second, when did we ever consent to this inequality? But Locke wants to argue that this is based on consent. And it's a real question though. So why in society, like even today, we think of people on Wall Street making tons of money. Why is it legitimate for these people to make all this money when there are other people that are poor or not making as much money? This is a question you should keep in mind. What he says is that paradoxically, there's a greater appropriation is good for society. You can think about it this way. It's a very famous phrase that economists use sometimes. A rising tide lifts all boats. When somebody is making lots of money, they end up wanting more luxury goods. They want a cruise ship. They want to go to space. They want to do all these different things. And that gives work to other people that they can make money. So ultimately, it ends up helping society. It's sort of a trickle-down effect, you could say. Now, there are a lot of people criticize this and say, well, that's not really what's going on. But there's strong arguments. The arguments behind capitalism are strongly influenced by John Locke. The idea that if you just allow people to freely move about and the government doesn't intervene with things, then some people make more money than others. They'll use that money for charities and other things. And so society will actually be much better off than if government is controlling everything. Now, what is this labor value theory that I mentioned? He says labor creates the value. So 99 out of 100, that's how much value. So if you can think of a barren land, it's worthless. But as soon as you put your work into it, build a house, build an orchard, then it's worth 99 times more. He says what the earth furnishes is almost worthless. Nations of America are rich in land, but poor in all comforts of life. And this is a very famous phrase by him. He says, John Locke says, a king of a large and fruitful territory in America feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England. What does that mean? What it means is that even somebody that's poor, that's working in a factory in England, is better off than a Native American king. Now that might seem strange to us, but if you think about it, the day laborer, the worker, the factory worker in England has all these luxuries, has the ability to, has a steady income, has food, has the government protecting him, whereas has medicine. Whereas in America this time, maybe there aren't these conveniences. Now, of course, Rousseau, which we'll read later, will laugh at this and criticize and say, how can this be true? How can a factory worker in England be better off than a Native American? Yeah, right. That's not the case at all, because the Native American has true freedom and equality, whereas somebody in a factory is enslaved to working and is at the mercy of their owner. So we can't really think of this as genuinely freedom and equality, but we'll get to that. Now, in the first treatise that you didn't read, but I just kind of want to give you some background information, because you might say, well, Locke, it's a little too greedy, too capitalistic. Locke does say that you do have some duty to charity. So he says, as justice gives every man a title to the product of his honest industry, and the fair acquisitions of his ancestors descended to him. So charity gives every man a title to so much out of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want, where he has no means to subsist otherwise. So you have a poor person who doesn't have anything to eat, in some ways has a right to demand some help. And a rich man has, in some ways, a duty to give the surplus of what they have to those who are in need. So you can think of the modern welfare state, for instance. So government has the right to regulate property and to make sure that certain people have a certain minimum level and there's a certain welfare. And so that is compatible with what you might say Lockean political thought. Now, here's some main takeaways that you should think about. Locke is the father of classical liberalism. Liberalism means that the purpose of government is to protect individual rights and to allow free and equal individuals to decide how they want to live, not to make a certain type of society or make a certain type of common good society, but to allow individuals to really choose for themselves. And Locke is really the father of this classical liberal idea of the type of society that we live in today. So you can see, if you want to understand our society, if you want to criticize it or agree with it, you have to in some ways go back to Locke to understand it. Again, all men are equal and free. This is a central teaching of Locke's. And all have natural rights that predate government. And the role of government is to protect these rights. And the end of government is to secure these rights. Government is based on consent. I hope this sounds a little bit familiar, the Declaration of Independence. I'll mention this next time, but these are all sort of main takeaways from Locke's theories. And government must also be limited in the sense that, again, it's not trying to make a common good or make men moral, but simply to protect these rights and to assure that somebody else does not take them away. And also the right of revolution, which we'll talk about next time. Now I want to ask you some critical questions just to leave. I know I've gone on far too long, but I want to give you some critical questions here. Should individuals have an unlimited right of property? Should individuals be able to make 700 times more than the poorest citizen? This is a real question that we have today. This is something that people are debating. Is this system fundamentally flawed because it allows some individuals to accumulate a great deal more of money? But then again, does it actually make society better? You think there's a great deal of economic inequality in America where there's some individuals that have a great deal of money. I just saw a Prime van drive by my office, and so Jeff Bezos, he has lots of money. But you could say, well, it's made life much more convenient. People can order Amazon, you can order books, you can order whatever you want, and it can be to you sometimes in even 2 hours, right? So even though he's made tons of money and we're unequal to him, we've actually benefited. Society has improved. Again, you can make arguments to the contrary, but it's something that needs to be taken into consideration. And the last comment that I'll make is more radical, is that under this Lockean system, does life become a joyless quest for joy? So we live today, we want to work, we want to have our jobs, we want to be like everybody else. But does this just simply make us slaves to our work? This is the more radical criticism that people have, that this type of society creates human beings that only care about money, that they're individualistic, that are materialistic, and this is very problematic. But again, you could also say that Locke's system allows for human beings to live a different type of life if they so choose. If you want to live a life of religious faith, or if you want to live a life of devotion, of volunteering and working, helping others, you can do that under the Lockean system. But with all those complex ideas, I'll let you think and stew about them, and I'll end our class for today